Can you, with your left hand, hit something like the F1 key?
Can't remember what F1 does now. Does anything?
That's on the roof.
Oh, okay. That'd be great. Yeah, so it would liven this up a bit. You know, it would take it outside of it, which would be great. I think we should do that. I think Chris would go. I think it should be stamped out.
But then, you know, perverse, so you shouldn't be allowed to vote anyway.
I don't vote ever. Never have. I did actually vote once.
Virtually on the spot.
Sure.
So I'm just gonna, otherwise my focus will get apart. Okay. whenever you want.
Okay. Self-defense fits in obviously with, you know, the right and the duty of the individual to defend themselves, to actualise themselves. It's part and parcel, I suppose, of self-determination, self-actualisation, having a rational, healthy mind in a physically fit and healthy body.
What do you understand by the word libertarianism?
Well, the word libertarianism stands for... Sorry, can I start that again, because
Sure.
I pronounced it oddly.
Don't worry.
Stage 4.
Okay, we still rolling?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, you know.
I know the question, yeah. The word libertarianism describes a broad range of philosophies which are basically concerned with individual liberty, individual freedom. In a sense, it's a bit like the word socialism. It's hard to define it exactly because it does cover, you know, a broad range of ideas, a broad range of philosophies which are connected, as I said, with individual freedom. There are, in a sense, 57 varieties, although there are some which are more predominant, more important than others. The word is of more recent currency. A word that used to be used to describe these philosophies was the word liberal. But of course in America the word liberal has now been perverted. It means the exact reverse of what it used to mean. It now means, you know, someone who believes in government intervention, in socialism and so on. And in other countries, in England and in Europe generally, it's almost become meaningless. It doesn't really describe anything very, very clearly. So because of this degradation of the word liberal, the word libertarian is generally used.
So what are the defining characteristics of libertarianism?
Well, they are, I suppose, certainly in the variety that I support, a total support for individual liberty in every area of life, in every area of politics, social behaviour, sexual behaviour and so on. It's a commitment to natural rights, the natural rights of the individual to live uncoerced by any other individual or group of individuals. It means the right to engage in consenting capitalist acts between adults. It means the right to engage in consenting sexual acts between adults. It means the right to be free of censorship, of controls over what one does in one's social life, one's political life, one's economic life, one's sexual life, and so on and so on. In other words, it means, you know, the right to be free, the right to engage in any sort of behaviour, as long as it isn't coercive or invasive of the rights of other peoples. So really the only restriction upon individual liberty is really that of respecting the rights of other people's individual liberty.
Okay.
Can I just have a
Sure.
wipe off?
Yeah, no worries.
Well, I sweat
Don't you
very
have
easily.
some,
Yeah.
I don't know if you want. I don't know.
Put the question
Okay,
again. So
sure. Okay, ready?
Okay. Rolling?
Yeah.
Action.
What role does private property rights and anti-statism play within the libertarian position?
well, there are two sorts of libertarians. I'm really replying to the bit about anti-statism. Sorry, of course, I'm not answering questions. Start again. Start
Sure.
again.
Okay. What should I say?
Yeah.
What role does anti-statism
Yeah.
play within
Yeah.
libertarianism?
Within libertarian thought, all libertarians are obviously opposed to state power invading the rights of individuals. They're opposed to the state interfering in the economic life of the individual. They're opposed to the state taxing the individual. They're opposed to the state telling the individual what he or she can do in bed or what he or she can read, how people can live their lives generally. Now, there are some libertarians who would argue that, in fact, you don't need the state at all, that we can, in fact, completely privatise the state. That is, any legitimate functions which the state serves, which is, for example, to protect individuals against criminals or to arbitrate disputes, to have courts or whatever. Some libertarians who call themselves anarcho-capitalists would argue that can be, in fact, those services can be entirely supplied by the free market, by private enterprise. So there are some libertarians who are opposed to the state completely. There are then some other libertarians who call themselves limited statists who would argue that in fact we do need a state, but really just to supply those basic services of the police force, the courts and an army. In other words, a basic service to protect against aggression, the invasion of individual rights. So there is a division within the libertarian movement between those two poles, although of course all are opposed, as they would see it, to the invasion of individual rights.
Great. What is the role of private property rights within libertarianism?
Libertarians would argue that, in a sense, private property is the most fundamental right of all, that in fact all our rights stem from the right of private property in our own body. In other words, they would criticise those conservatives, for example, who sometimes say they defend property rights, but at the same time want to have the state controlling what you can read or what you can do in bed and so on, or interfering in the sexual and civil liberties of individuals. Libertarians will say, well, that's an invasion of the most basic property right, which is the property we own in our person. From there, of course, individuals, libertarians, would argue against socialists because they would say that we have a right to private property, we have a right to the fruits of our labour. Ironically, this is a phrase that sometimes the socialists use to defend what they call the working classes. Well, we libertarians see ourselves really as the defenders of the working classes because it's work which produces private property. And work also means productive investment. The investor, the banker and so on is as much a worker in this respect and has a right to the fruits of their private property. So libertarians are consistent defenders of private property. They extend the protection of private property consistently, they would see it, to protect the right of the property in our persons, in our actions, and in the fruits of our actions. In other words, to have the fruits of our labours respected, which means, of course, we don't believe in taxation. We don't believe the state has any right to seize the fruits of the workers' property.
Okay, great.
There was an aeroplane there. Did it bother you?
Well, was it picked up easily or not?
I could hear it. It'll be okay if you use the whole thing, but not if you cut, obviously, in the middle.
Yeah. Well, let's use it.
Okay.
Let's leave it. I mean,
Nice,
there's
yeah.
so much to go through. Okay, great. Well, we'll skip that thing about Plato and Aristotle. Then.
Yeah.
How would you characterise political and economic thinking in the West prior to the emergence of liberalism?
Libertarianism,
Can we just wait for
Yeah.
that?
Okay.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. Okay.
Action.
How would you characterise political and economic thinking in the West prior to the emergence of liberalism?
Libertarianism, I would argue, is very, very distinctively a Western and European philosophy. It's emerged very much out of the whole intellectual tradition of the West. Now, even in the pre-liberal period, it's interesting that I think that the Western tradition has always been much more oriented towards the individual. So even in the pre-liberal period, you might say, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages and so on, when I suppose Western thought was much more collectivist, much more obviously feudal, that supported absolute power of one sort or another. Even then it was tempered with liberal elements, that emerged from, we might argue, the sort of Aristotelian tradition in European thought, out of Christianity to a degree, with its recognition of the limits on temporal power through spiritual power and so on. Sorry.
Pause it.
Okay, or not.
Shall we?
Yeah,
Do you mind?
that was
Yeah,
well,
it's a fairly complicated one, that
Yeah.
actually. But,
It's good, it's great.
yeah.
I mean, I think that's fine. Okay.
Right, action.
How would you characterise political and economic thinking in the West prior to the emergence of liberalism?
In the pre-liberal period in Europe, in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages and so on, European thought and practice was obviously much more oriented towards collectivism. The state in various forms intervened in economic life, in obviously political life and religious life and so on, in every area of life. The emphasis was authoritarianism, state power, mercantilism, that is the control of the economy by the state and so on. But what's interesting is the fact that even though this was true, European Western practice was even then much more liberal. There was a strong strand of both sort of Aristotelian thought, of scientific thought, of a recognition of the role of the individual. Even within Christianity, there was an emphasis, I suppose, on the limits of temporal power imposed by spiritual power, and so on. And it's out of that background, that European background, I suppose, of sort of scientific thought, religious thought, and indeed practice, I suppose, the fact that in many respects there was a sort of decentralized state because of feudalism, out of, we might say, anarchic conditions, out of a favourable intellectual background, that is a background that at least had some connection to aspects of individualism, aspects of rationalism and so on, that provided a fertile ground for liberalism to grow out of. And that's why a distinctive liberal philosophy emerged in Europe rather than really than out of any other civilization in world history. So this is a very complicated, indeed interesting matter in which sort of scholars are working at this moment. So I think one can say that liberalism is connected very closely to European the European tradition, the European intellectual tradition, very closely. It's something, you know, organically connected in a way.
Great. How did... Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Great. How did liberalism first emerge as a distinct doctrine?
Liberalism emerged over, I suppose, a century of time. It emerged in various ways. It emerged in religious terms with the emergence of people opposed to statist interpretations of Christianity, to people who wish to exercise religious freedom. It emerged from people like that who, once they'd started a libertarian interpretation of Christianity, realised that this applied also to other areas of life, or could be applied to other areas of life. So within Britain, you have a very strong connection between dissenting Christianity, between various dissenting sects in Britain, and classical libertarian thought, which is very strong. I mean, Herbert Spencer, for example, the great 19th century libertarian, emerged out of that sort of religious background, out of a long religious tradition of libertarianism. At the same time, you have largely secular thinkers like the Levellers during the British Civil War, who elaborated a very radical individualist philosophy of natural rights, applied both in the social area and the economic area. So you suddenly get it's a very interesting question to analyse. You know, exactly how libertarianism emerged. It's an area in which, you know, scholars are working at this moment. It's a complicated area. We still really, in a sense, don't know the full details and exactly why one thing led to another. All we can say is that at one particular moment in time, there was really this explosion of libertarian thought in sort of 17th, 18th century. And it was that explosion of thought, really, which liberated our societies, or liberated Western societies, swept aside the sort of feudal restrictions, the mercantilist restrictions, explained to people, you know, why it was a good thing to be free, you know, why freedom profited them in every area of life, you know, the economic, the religious, the social, and so on, why it was a good thing, why they were entitled to be free. All these strands of thought sort of emerged in various areas, in the religious area, in the political area, in the economic area, and it's that support for individual liberty which led to the growing practice of individual liberty, and really led then to the Industrial Revolution, which in a sense ought to be called the Capitalist Revolution. There wouldn't have been an Industrial Revolution if there wasn't first that Capitalist Revolution, and really which freed us and gave us the liberties we enjoy now, the prosperity we enjoy now, insofar as we still enjoy them, that is.
Okay, that's great. Now another question is leading me on from that, not here. What is the libertarian view of the French Revolution and its aftermath?
Libertarians have a somewhat ambiguous view of the French Revolution. On the one hand, they're obviously interested in the libertarian strands of opinion which resulted in their revolution. On the other hand, at the same time, it's interesting to observe that both libertarianism as a systematic body of thought really came into being at the same time as socialism emerged as a systematic body of thought at the same time. And within the French Revolution, there were those two strands of thought. And I think most libertarians would argue that the sort of socialist ideas at the time really corrupted the liberal ideas and led to the atrocities and obscenities that then occurred during the French Revolution. So I think we would argue that the French Revolution was in one way a good thing. It swept aside many of the feudal restrictions that were still existing within France, but on the other hand was rapidly corrupted by socialistic and statist elements of thought and hence practice. So that the French Revolution was in many respects a tragedy. It probably would have been better if it hadn't occurred. The cost in the end in human lives, and indeed the example that the French Revolution then set for many socialists was a bad thing. So there's an ambiguity in our evaluation, although I think in the end we would come out on in terms of one of opposition to the French Revolution.
Great. Okay. Who were the major philosophers of classical liberalism in the 18th and 19th centuries?
The major philosophers of libertarianism in 18th and 19th centuries, I suppose many of them are dealt with in most of the standard histories of ideas that people will read at university and so on. Obviously names like John Locke come to mind, and Jeremy Bentham, and then in economics you have Adam Smith. There are also lesser known people which the contemporary libertarians have rediscovered. Richard Lilburn, for example, amongst the levellers in the 18th century in Britain, was certainly very important, although he's really less remembered now. The 18th century Scottish Enlightenment thinkers were very important. I'm not sure whether we categorise them exactly as philosophers. In many respects they were, I think we used the word sociologists, although that wasn't a term used at the time. Obviously Adam Smith, the founder of economics, who was at the same time not merely an economic thinker, he was a thinker in the areas of morality, psychology and social thought generally. Colleagues of his, such as John Miller and Adam Ferguson, also created a very interesting liberal sociology, a liberal philosophy of class conflict, economic progress, economic sociology, we might use that term. I think certainly one would have to focus upon those Scottish thinkers as being very important insofar as they were really the founders of economic science, which has taught us about so much about how an economy can work and why a free economy can work, does work, and is the only way that prosperity can be brought to the great mass of ordinary people. There are many great libertarian thinkers who were certainly important at the time, and yet contemporary libertarians would also feel ambiguous about, certainly Jeremy Bentham, and the philosophical radicals, the utilitarians and so on, like James Mill, and of course John Stuart Mill as well. All these were very important thinkers. And at the same time, they were also ambiguous thinkers, and I think this is where contemporary libertarianism has in a sense made a step forward. Contemporary libertarians would argue that there were, of course, many faults within classical liberal thought, many errors, which in some respects led to the decline of classical liberalism, or led to counter-attacks by socialist thought. In other words, many of the classical liberal thinkers simply got it wrong in many areas, or had a deficient concept of individual rights, or, like the utilitarians, in a sense abandoned the concept of natural rights for the concept of utility and the greatest good of the greatest number, which really is a formula in the end for tyranny, not for liberty. So although they were indeed real libertarians themselves and committed to liberty, the errors in their philosophic thought led to the undermining of liberty. So libertarians have obviously a critical and a self-critical relationship to their own philosophical tradition. They look for the errors within it which have led to the problems of our own time, as much as they look to it for example and for truth as well. So we're looking at a great many thinkers, and we're looking not merely at the merits of their thought, but also at the demerits of their thought. And that's, I think, is one of the reasons why libertarianism is now as a much stronger version of liberalism than 19th century liberalism.
Great. What effect did the ideas of these 18th and 19th century figures have on the politics and society of that time?
In looking at why a free society emerged in 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, we're looking at a very complicated issue. We're looking at an issue which relates not merely to abstract thought, but to concrete practice as well. We're looking at it, in a sense, we're looking at a philosophy of history, a philosophical interpretation of history. I think most libertarians would argue that ideas have a very primary causative role in historical progress. They would argue that the reason we have a relatively free society today in the West, and the reason that that society emerged in the West, was because distinctive ideas emerged. In other words, liberal ideas were developed and spread throughout society, and people lived according to those ideas and behaved according to those ideas, and resisted, the power of the state and so on as a result of accepting those ideas. So libertarians would see a direct causative role for ideas within history. At the same time, of course, they would also look at other factors as well. We might see sort of purely contingent historical factors, pure historical accident. Some of those accidents might actually be the result of geographical factors. They might be the result of elements of economic evolution, for example. So libertarians would also look at the way in which state power, coercive power within Europe, had become, in a sense, anarchic, had become decentralized in a way, that the absolute state was really never absolute within Europe, that there was always clashes of power between different power groups, between different classes and so on, and that out of those relationships of conflict, many of them in a sense neutralized each other. So some powers neutralized other powers, so that sort of freedom emerged in a sense in the margins between different overlapping spheres of power, so that there were areas where in a sense power didn't touch, or power had been neutralized or made less powerful. And so partly that was accidental, that was just a contingent result of particular social and economic conflicts within Europe, some of which emerged as a result of geography, some of which emerged as a result of simply the way the economy was functioning at that time. So we would say fortuitous accidents also favoured Europe in that period of the evolution of liberty, and these things came together. Perhaps in a sense it's impossible. I mean, science, in a sense, the social sciences can never be as exact as the physical sciences, and we can never really, truly, in the end, explain with the exactitude we can of physical science why something happened in history or in social processes. But I think libertarians would argue that, in a sense, there were two things coming together. There were the intellectual currents which were producing a free society, and there were the contingent factors which had emerged out of social and economic evolution, and both of those led to the emergence of free societies and free economies in Western Europe during the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries.
Great. Why did the classical liberal tradition become eclipsed by statism, socialism and Marxism?
I think classical liberalism and libertarianism declined, especially in the 19th century, as a result of two factors. I think they declined as a result of some of their own intellectual failings, that there were elements within libertarian thought which unfortunately undermined its own libertarianism. I think, for example, the rise of utilitarianism, i.e. the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number, tended to undermine the doctrine of individual rights. Within economics, certain erroneous ideas regarding the labour theory of value and so on undermined the accuracy of economic analysis. I think to a degree certain elements of Christianity also undermined classical liberalism. That the classical liberals, in the end, were not prepared, I think, to jettison the moral heritage of Christianity, the ideas of altruism and so on, the ideas of the sovereignty of God over man. In other words, they weren't prepared to defend fully the egoistic premises of classical liberalism, that the individual belonged to him and herself, and therefore it was right to be selfish and so on. They still accepted doctrines of self-sacrifice and altruism that were very strong, obviously, because of Christianity. So I think liberalism declined because it failed to be radical enough, liberal enough, and allowed older ideas of collectivism, the religious heritage of unselfishness, of altruism and so on, to revive in the new forms of socialism. So I think it failed intellectually. It failed to answer some of the criticisms that were made by socialist thinkers. Sometimes it failed to be radical enough. It failed to apply its own ideas radically enough. So socialists were able to make quite legitimate criticisms of certain social and economic practices of the time, but they blamed those practices upon capitalism rather than upon the remainders of statism, the remainders of government intervention. And the liberals failed, I think, to sweep aside and identify those elements of statism, medievalism, if you want to call it that, which were still in the Western societies and which were responsible for, I think, the economic and social abuses that were still in their time. So, ironically, the socialists were able to take on some of the mantle of liberalism, some of the radicalism of liberalism, in a cause which was unfortunately unjust and couldn't possibly do away with those abuses.
Great.
Did that spoil it, or?
Didn't spoil
No,
visually.
no,
The
it's
cat did brush the microphone with his tail.
I'm sure it won't be a problem.
Probably not.
But let's carry on. I think
Okay.
the cat's very photogenic. Okay, terrific. Right, everything okay?
Can you hold one second?
It looks like we've got a lot of threads. Well, I mean, I hope you don't mind. I mean,
No. I've put the whole day aside. Let me have a bit more booze.
Yeah, probably need it.
Should we get some more beer?
Do you want a beer?
Don't have a fizzy drink at all.
Yeah.
In
Do you mind having
my
Diet
fridge,
Coke?
there's some.
No,
Oh, I was going
no,
to say there's some fizzy water in the fridge still as well.
We brought some mineral water of our own, actually.
Right.
Do you want to have some Diet Coke
That'll be fine.
or else mineral water?
No, Diet Coke would be great.
Or
I'm on a diet,
beer.
so
Oh, we're the ones who need
Yeah, exactly.
Do you want one then?
Yeah, if you like one, that one. Should we wait till Martin gets back?
Yeah,
Otherwise,
sure.
What conditions led to the re-emergence of these liberal and individualist ideas in the 20th century?
I think the re-emergence of classical liberal ideas in the modern libertarian movement came from two sources. On the one hand, it emerged out of what might I say social practice, emerged simply out of reality. Fact is that both literally and metaphorically, socialism, Marxism, collectivism, in all its various forms, as I say, from Soviet Marxism to German National Socialism, Nazism, had simply had a fair crack of the whip, and I mean that sort of metaphorically and literally. It had actually had a lot of opportunity to put its ideas into effect in policies, both within the West generally and throughout the world. And those ideas have quite clearly failed. They produced, massacre, suffering, the gulag, the concentration camps. It had produced depression, poverty, economic decline, and so on. In other words, it was becoming more and more obvious that socialism, in all its varieties, in all its forms, didn't produce what the socialists claimed, didn't produce happiness, didn't produce prosperity, didn't produce freedom. And that was becoming more and more obvious to people. At the same time, a number of thinkers were simply rediscovering that tradition and re-enunciating it. And I think one would have to look at two major thinkers here. I think you'd have to look at the Russian-born Jewish novelist Ayn Rand, who managed to get out of the Soviet Union and go to America, and who really elaborated the very radical sort of neo-Aristotelian philosophy, which she calls objectivism, which is probably the most consistently radical and individualist development of libertarian ideas. And she attempted to really put forward a completely systematic philosophy of individual liberty, growing out of not merely ethics, but out of epistemology, metaphysics, applying her ideas to aesthetics and so on, as well as simply towards economics and politics. And her rediscovery or recreation of radical individualism, of a radical natural rights philosophy, was probably the most important element in the revival of classical liberalism. Even for those people who didn't necessarily follow all of her philosophy, it was her reassertion of the value of capitalism, especially the moral value of capitalism, which put lots of people onto the path towards libertarianism. And she was also, in a sense, instrumental in encouraging the other sort of major pole of the libertarian revival, that is the revival of free market economics in the form of the so-called Austrian school of economics, so-called because a number of its major proponents were either Austrian or had lived in Austria and so on, although many of them in fact actually also lived and worked in Britain and America and so on. The two major thinkers in the so-called Austrian school were Professor Friedrich Hayek and indeed his teacher, Professor Ludwig von Mises. And between them, these two economists really reasserted a very vigorous form of free market analysis, and also answered many of the criticisms which hadn't really been effectively answered before from the socialists within the area of economics. So while at the time Ayn Rand was really, I think, sort of reasserting the philosophical, ethical tradition of classical liberalism and purging it of its previous errors, von Mises and Hayek were doing the same within the economic realm, but they were very, very influential in really leading to this revival of free market economics. At the same time, I think one should also have to mention Milton Friedman as well, and the so-called Chicago School of Economics, who, independently of the Austrian school, were also reviving a distinctive variety of economic science, and had a tremendous influence within the universities in America and for that matter within Britain. So I think we'd have to go down to, as I say, Ayn Rand on the one side within philosophy, the Austrian school and the Chicago school in economics.
Great.
God, I'm getting covered with cat's hair now as well.
Oh, don't worry, I don't think how big it is. Are you okay, Paul?
Fine.
Oh, good.
Just have a brushed out. But really what libertarianism is all about is gaining complete control over the world.
Why not? You're very...
It's actually, you could use that as the final shot of the whole programme.
Should we do that? Let's take that. Paul, do you want to turn the camera down here a bit so you can see Chris? Whilst stroking.
I'd have to be doing it like this, actually. I'd have to be doing it like this.
Why not?
Yes, but...
Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
Just take it
I'll
down here from below and say from about there. Yeah,
it's like
Do you want to turn the cat this way, or is that difficult?
he usually strokes it like this, doesn't it, the guy?
Oh, yes,
it's
it's,
sort of like this, yes.
Don Pleasant
Yes.
something it was, wasn't it?
But
What was that in the
but-
Bond films?
Oh,
right.
But really,
I'm
you're,
not sure we consider this a
you're
cat.
not. Oh,
Can you turn him around a bit? Oh, like that? Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
That's it,
that's
that's it.
Hold on, let me just focus. That's it.
Really, what libertarianism is all about is for me to gain complete control over the world. You're not filming that, are you?
Can I have just one more for a
Get
slightly
your
different
bum down, cat. Come on, be cooperative. You're a star.
Okay.
Okay, rolling.
But really, libertarianism is all about me gaining complete control over the world. You're not filming that, are you?
Action.
How did these ideas coalesce into the formation of the contemporary libertarian movement in the USA in the 1960s?
The major impetus to the emergence of the libertarian movement in America during the 1960s was undoubtedly Ayn Rand's work. The sale of her novels, Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, We the Living, and of non-fictional collections of essays like For the New Intellectual, The Virtue of Selfishness, Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal. These were books that sold millions and millions of copies and created, although they were ignored by the academic establishment largely, or despised by the academic establishment, had enormous underground influence upon young people in America. And I think really one does have to say it really was virtually a single-handed result of Ayn Rand's work. This inspired so many young people, many of whom either adopted her ideas in whole or adapted them or extended them in different fields or were influenced them by them in one way or another. And that really led to the emergence of what we now call the libertarian movement in America. It was her promotion too of the ideas of the Austrian school which very much helped popularise the work of Hayek and von Mises as well. So she had a sort of an input into that area too. And that really led to, as I said, the emergence of the contemporary libertarian movement. Many of these young people would disagree with Ayn Rand on some areas or would disagree with her particular political strategies. And many of them, for example, then set up a thing called the Libertarian Party, which had become the third largest party in America. Not all libertarians necessarily agreed with the idea of having a political party. Some would either want to work within either the Democrats or the Republicans, or in fact didn't like the idea of having a political party or working via political parties at all. They thought that simply working within the academic realm was the major way to change political practice. So it was the result of Ayn Rand's work stimulating and inspiring so many young people, which really led to the emergence in the 60s. I think one would also, in addition to Miss Rand's work too, there were also other libertarian currents of thought going on at the same time. Funnily enough, the original New Left in America had quite a few libertarian elements and strands of thought within it. For example, the opposition to the draft was very strong amongst New Leftists, and obviously opened them to the idea of individual liberty. After all, how do you justify opposition to the draft? You have to justify it on some concept of individual liberty, of self-ownership, or so on. So that inclined many of the New Left towards a sort of a libertarian approach to social issues, and the New Left declined in a sense because of that, because of an internal conflict between libertarian strands of thought within it and between orthodox socialist strands of thought. And there was also during the 60s as well quite a lot of cooperation between New Leftists and libertarians over issues like the conscription, the Vietnam War, opposition to sort of Big Brother in the bedroom and so on, support for women's rights, opposition to racism, racial discrimination and so on. So there's quite a lot of common ground between the New Left and the libertarian movement, which was quite fruitful. So I think that's really the background of the 1960s, the influence of Ayn Rand's work, the emergence of a degree of libertarianism in the New Left at the same time, and really just the spreading of these ideas, from being the property of only a few small groups of people who were considered cranks. They gradually became had wider and wider currency, throughout the universities, amongst young people, and gradually started percolating as well through, literature, pop music, science fiction, popular culture generally. So, you start to get the emergence of a broad cultural libertarian movement.
Great. How did the libertarian movement emerge in the UK?
Within Britain, I suppose libertarianism emerged in broadly in a rather similar way to America. Again, you had the influence of Ayn Rand. You also had the influence of Hayek and von Mises in the economic area. You also had the influence of Milton Friedman's Chicago School. We'd have to trace that back as well to the role of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was set up in the late 50s by Ralph Harris, now Lord Harris, and Arthur Selden. And it was the Institute of Economic Affairs, or the IEA as it's generally known, which almost single-handedly promoted and sort of reclaimed the whole tradition of free market economics in this country. And by a vigorous program of publications, of pamphlets, books, monographs, etc., on free market economics, and by networking generally throughout the academic world and promoting these ideas in the press and to politicians and so on, very much single-handedly transformed the area of economic thought in this country and really pushed economic libertarianism, although they generally really weren't concerned with the sort of social and moral areas of libertarian thought. So the IEA was certainly very important here as well. And I think too, especially during the 1970s, you had this just very obvious collapse of socialist practice. It just became increasingly obvious in Britain, as elsewhere, that socialism didn't work. We had the trade unions were just becoming increasingly abusive of their power. The economy was just declining through restrictive practices, through government intervention and over-regulation in virtually every area of economic life. It just became increasingly obvious to more and more people. So people's minds were then simply more open to the ideas being enunciated by the IEA, by Ayn Rand and so on. And my organisation, the Libertarian Alliance, was actually set up in the late 1960s. And we tried to sort of advocate these ideas and put out leaflets and pamphlets for a long time without really much response from anybody. It was very, very difficult. You could virtually fit all the libertarians in England into my living room. It was as bad as that. But then suddenly, really, it was in the end of the 60s that these ideas seemed to sort of just catch fire. Just suddenly, there were young people coming to us. People, were seeking us out. And suddenly, within the Conservative Party, these ideas started catching on, especially amongst young people in the Conservative Party. So suddenly, within things like the Federation of Conservative Students, libertarian ideas were catching on. And suddenly you had Conservative students arguing for the abolition of immigration controls, the legalisation of all drugs, the removal of restrictions on sexual behaviour, the end of censorship, so on and so on. And indeed, it was precisely the popularity of these ideas in the Federation of Conservative Students which led to Conservative Central Office closing down the Federation on spurious grounds in order to stop this influence. Of course, it didn't stop it, and the ideas have spread even further. So libertarianism has a very strong input into the Conservative Party via young people. And in years ahead, that will certainly pay off in terms of national politics, I think. So that's really, I think, the scenario in Britain. Again, the influence of Ayn Rand, the influence of the revival of free market economics, the failure of socialism becoming obvious, the growing influence of libertarian ideas, the growing responsiveness of young people to libertarian ideas. Similar to America, although Britain has its own, in a sense, distinctive patterns and in a sense, distinctive preferences. So there are differences between British and European libertarianism to American libertarianism. There are policy differences and differences of sort of philosophical emphasis.
Great. Should we just like very quickly ask what are the differences between British continental and American libertarianism?
The differences between English and, or should I say, British and European libertarianism and American libertarianism, I think, centre on two areas. One, European libertarianism is less factional than American libertarianism, because many of the leaders of libertarian schools of thought are based in America. This tends to lead, naturally enough, to factionalism within the movement, on between cults of personality and so on, amongst the various leaders of the various brands of libertarianism. And you simply don't, because those leaders aren't in this country, you don't tend to get that same sort of factionalism and cults of personality. So British libertarians tend to be less enamoured or less fanatical over particular styles or brands of libertarian thought. So you get that difference. Secondly, there are also, I think, cultural differences. Many of the American libertarians tend to be rather populist, because they come from a society which, in a sense, is culturally more favourable or more receptive to libertarianism. They tend to think that libertarians ought to concentrate, in a sense, on converting the mass man, the average person, whereas European libertarians tend to emphasise, and I think this is a correct emphasis, that really you must be going for the commanding heights of the intellectual world, and the ideas percolate down that way, and therefore spend less time trying to do things. Well, for example, libertarians in Britain and Europe, will not form a libertarian party. We just simply think that's ridiculous, an absolute waste of time, trying to sort of aim your propaganda and material simply at ordinary people in order to get votes. We argue that the struggle must be one to gain intellectual hegemony first, and these sorts of things come second. So, ironically, the European libertarians tend to be, in a sense, more intellectual and more concerned with conquering and maintaining intellectual hegemony, and not to waste time simply on handing leaflets out on the street to the sort of the man on the Clapham omnibus, this sort of idea. There are also then differences, especially differences in the area of foreign policy. There's quite a strong heritage of isolationism within America, which in a sense is understandable. One can understand why it seems more feasible simply not to get involved in foreign disputes. If you're in America, you're thousands of miles away from other countries, your borders seem secure and so on. Foreign squabbles seem to be irrelevant. So American libertarianism has a strong emphasis on an isolationist foreign policy, and tends to argue that many international problems would go away if people simply minded their own business and maintained this sort of isolationist attitude. European libertarians are far less sure that that's a workable, feasible or desirable policy, and would argue that many of the American libertarians simply are just very unsophisticated over issues of foreign policy, over issues of international relations, and that the simple formulas of restricting foreign policy to, well, in a sense, not having a foreign policy, of arguing that you needn't interfere in the affairs of other nations. I think Europeans would tend to argue that's a simplistic and unworkable policy. However, that is still a debate that is, that is maintained in this country as well. But I think you'll find on the whole that European libertarians tend to reject the isolationist approach in foreign policy, whereas there's a tendency for Americans to endorse that approach.
Great. Okay, well, that's the end of part one.
Right.
How did you first become attracted to libertarianism?
I've always been, I suppose, what you might call a gut libertarian for as long as I can remember. I always was in favour of being free. It seemed to me that the individual had a right to live his and her life free of coercion, bullying, interference by other people, whether those people call themselves the state or the church or whatever. So I just always sort of had this gut feeling that liberty was the right policy, that individuals should be free. I suppose personally I was quite lucky. I had very sort of liberal oriented parents who in sort of all areas of life were very open, very liberal, very progressive in their attitudes. So I suppose I absorbed something from my family background. I think I also absorbed a lot from science fiction, like a lot of libertarians. Science fiction has always been a very pro-individual liberty, pro-science, pro-rationality form of literature. These ideas have been very influential within it, and I'm pretty sure that I absorbed a lot of those ideas from writers like Robert Heinlein and Powell Anderson and so on. Science fiction, which was a taste I inherited from my dad, I think was very influential upon me intellectually. Before I discovered, the actual political philosophers of libertarianism. And I suppose on another area, my mum was very intellectual, very interested in ideas. So from an early age, I sort of absorbed very sort of pro-feminist ideas as well, and so I didn't absorb any sort of reactionary ideas about women. So that put me on the path of radical feminism at the same time. So I suppose I consider myself lucky to have had a good family background, and lucky in a sense to have read the right books when I was young and to be influenced by those books. And also I suppose by the values of popular culture as well, which is an area a lot of libertarians are very interested in. A lot of what you might call high culture has been corrupted by collectivist ideas, by ideas of pessimism, anti-individualism, the ideas of defeat and degradation. I think Colin Wilson, in one of his books about modern literature, calls his book The Age of Defeat. And there is this, amongst a lot of what we call high culture and respected literature, this atmosphere of defeat and despair, and which I think has a lot to answer for the plight of our culture now. But if you go to popular culture, despised popular culture, if you go to thrillers and science fiction films and adventure films, it's there that you find ideas of justice. It's there. You don't have any sympathy for the villains. You don't have any sympathy for society is not to blame in these films. It's quite clear that the individual is to blame. The individual has free will. The themes of films like Dirty Harry and so on. Themes of films like Death Wish and so on. It's the idea that the individual should protect him and herself. That society is not to blame, individuals are responsible for their behaviour. And these sorts of themes, a man's got to do what a man's got to do sort of thing, is very strong, in the Western, the thriller, the detective film, the police drama, etc., etc. So I think you find a lot of libertarians very much influenced by popular culture. They've, insofar as they've been moulded by society, they've been moulded by the best aspects of our society, which tend to be in popular culture and not in high culture. And of course many of us now as scholars tend to be very interested in defending popular culture and in fact arguing that popular culture is often superior, aesthetically, morally and philosophically to so-called high culture. So I think popular culture is very important.
Great. Well, I don't know whether we need to go to the next question, which is which particular issues and ideas attracted you. Should we ask that, or have we just gone over that?
I think it's almost gratuitous.
Yeah, it is. Okay. How did you form the Libertarian Alliance?
Okay. The Libertarian Alliance actually emerged out of a group that existed before it. One of the last of the, I suppose you might say, pre-war major liberals in this country was a chap called Ernest J.P. Benn. I think he's the great-grandfather of Tony Benn, the socialist politician now. He was also the founder of the publishing company of Benn. And Ernest Benn, after a brief flirtation with socialism, became a very radical, classical liberal activist and publicist. And he wrote a very important book called Our Enemy the State. And in fact, I think he wrote about 20 or 30 other books. Not particularly intellectually sophisticated, but very robust expositions of individual freedom. And he set up a group called the Society of Individualists, just before the war, and it existed after the war at the same time. That then renamed itself the Society for Individual Liberty, the Society for Individual Freedom, SIF. And that was, I suppose, one of the few sort of libertarian groups active after the Second World War during the 50s and early 60s. Now that had a youth wing that was called the Young Libertarians, for sort of people who were under 30. And that was in fact the first libertarian group that I discovered, and that's how I met a small group of about half a dozen other libertarians in this country. Now unfortunately the Society for Individual Freedom became infiltrated by, well, I can only describe it by some Nazis and anti-Semites who sort of managed to sort of take the organisation over, much to the distress of those of us who were libertarians. So we simply split off this youth wing from the group and renamed it initially the Radical Libertarian Alliance, although we then dropped off the radical, which we felt was gratuitous, and just called it the Libertarian Alliance. And that was how the Libertarian Alliance in effect emerged in the late 60s. I should add, by the way, that the Society for Individual Freedom still now does exist, and fortunately is no longer infiltrated by the group of Nazis who took it over during the 60s. But that's really how the Libertarian Alliance emerged, and it then took off really during the late 70s, although it was in existence from that time in the 60s. It really started getting its larger membership and really started getting its act together in terms of publishing, meetings and activities in the 70s.
Right. What sort of opposition have you faced?
Libertarians and myself personally have faced all sorts of opposition from every wing of the sort of political spectrum in this country. I mean, at university, one was regularly accused of being a fascist for some reason. I mean, this is, I think, perhaps the most galling of accusations to face. That a philosophy which is the polar opposite of the collectivist and statist ideas of fascism, to be called fascist is just unbelievable. It shows either the ignorance or the malice of the people who called it. But we were frequently called that. In other words, anyone who opposed Marxism or socialism just was called a fascist. And when I was at university, I had bricks thrown through my windows, swastikas painted up on my windows, all the usual sort of discrimination that you get at university, from the staff as well as students, if you hold to an unpopular idea. And libertarians have been badly persecuted in the academic world, in Britain and America. So there was opposition, obviously, from Marxists and socialists. And in later years, when, for example, I was running the Alternative Bookshop in London, which was the sort of base for libertarian activities here, we were firebombed, physically attacked, and so on by Marxist activists. Ironically, of course, at the same time as the Marxists and socialists were calling us fascists, the fascists were actually attacking us as well. So, because they saw us as representatives of rootless cosmopolitanism and Jewish capitalism and so on and so on. And the fact that a very large number of libertarian thinkers and indeed activists, like my wife, for example, who one of the major activists in the Libertarian Alliance with me, happened to be Jewish, or indeed even worked for the World Jewish Congress, of course, fueled the rage of the fascists and the Nazis. At the same time, of course, we had the opposition of the conservatives, who see us as being, undermining family values and being atheists, which most of us are, as being because we support, the sexual liberties of homosexuals, because we're opposed to immigration controls and so on. The conservatives see us, undermining the moral fibre of the nation and so on. So, we are opposed by the conservatives. So, if you're a libertarian, it can be quite tough. You're opposed by almost everyone on every part of the political spectrum, and attacked by them, misrepresented by them. We've had some really quite, horrible things aimed at us. As I said, from firebombings, physical attacks, to sort of smear campaigns accusing us of being Nazis and anti-Semites and things like this, So You have to have a bit of fire in your belly and a bit of steel in your spine, to be a libertarian.
Great. To what extent were libertarian ideas carried out in the 1980s?
Excuse me one moment.
Sure.
While cat hair all over me. Socialists and Marxists like to portray the 80s as being a time in which libertarian ideas were triumphant in every way. They attack the period as being sort of the me decade and of being one of selfishness and ruthless grasping capitalism and so on, and one in which what they call the new right, which is not a terminology we would accept, dominated politics in America and Britain, via Reagan and via Thatcher. Now, of course, it's true that socialism was becoming increasingly unpopular during this period. It's true that Reagan and Thatcher both were influenced to a degree by emerging libertarian ideas, and both tried to do something about the disastrous consequences of socialism in America and Britain. However, one's firstly got to recognise that although some progress was made in some areas, things like privatisation has occurred in Britain, there have been some reduction of tax rates and so on. All this has been very much tinkering, and the basic structure of state power has not really been affected in either Britain or America. If anything, it's growing. The power of state regulation in all areas of the economy is actually growing. Certainly in Britain it is. There's more regulation, for example, in the area of financial services. So, on the whole, the regulatory interventionist state has not really been tackled in Britain or America. There's been a tinkering to good effect, but no real radical restructuring of the political or economic order in either country. And also, one's also got to be aware that politicians of all stripes use ideas and rhetoric for their own purposes. Now, Thatcher and Reagan did use elements of libertarian rhetoric, but most of the time they either didn't understand it or didn't agree with it. And of course they certainly didn't extend it to areas of social life. Margaret Thatcher is still essentially a reactionary in every area of moral and social belief. And in fact in Britain, lots more legislation has been passed, restricting the social and sexual rights of the individual, and indeed many elements of traditional British common law have been sort of infringed by acts passed, during the. But at the same time as she was, in a sense, paying lip service to some sort of elements of economic libertarianism, the trouble was that Thatcher was completely reactionary over every other moral and social issue. So, there was the idea of the reimposition of, traditional family values. There were restrictions on rights of homosexuals, serious inroads into traditional common law liberties. For example, the presumption of innocence has been overruled regarding the prosecution of drugs, for example, whereby now people can have their property seized and you have to prove that you'd earned it legitimately and not through, the drugs trade and so on. A very, very serious inroad into the presumption of innocence. So in a great range of sort of social areas, the Thatcher period was a reactionary period, an area which limited individual liberties in moral and social areas. So I think libertarians, libertarians certainly don't see the 80s as being a period of libertarian sort of hegemony at all. We see it as an area in which some gains were made politically, and in which a period in which a lot of people realised the economic fallacies of socialism. But it's certainly not a period in which we see ourselves as having gained any sort of supremacy. We see it as a period of conflict, one of gains by our cause, but certainly, not one of a total victory.
Okay, great. What do you understand by the concept of natural rights?
the mainstream of libertarian thought adheres to the concept of natural rights. It's part of a long tradition of Western thought. Really, it goes back to Aristotle, which gets embodied in the sort of Catholic Thomistic theology, and which emerges in liberal thought, in the thought of John Locke, in the thought of benevolence, and so on. And by natural rights, what libertarians mean are essentially that human beings are a particular sort of entity, a particular sort of creature, and that the nature of human beings is the same universally. It's the same for all sexes, for all races of humanity, and it's true for humanity throughout all history. In other words, the essence of humanity does not change. And that essence of humanity is one which basically human beings require particular conditions in which to flourish. And those conditions are conditions of freedom, essentially. Therefore, for a human being to be a human being, to flourish as a human being, to fulfill their faculties, their potential as a human being, means that certain conditions must prevail in social life. And it's essentially those conditions which we label, in effect, human rights. We argue that human beings need to be free in order to flourish, to fulfill themselves as human beings, that freedom pertains to all human beings, of all races, of all sexes. And that's what we call natural rights, that in effect a human being, it's right for a human being to be free because that's the only way in which a human being can flourish and fulfill themselves. It's right for all human beings. In other words, you can't just have one human being free and others enslaved. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense of applying that analysis to one human being. It's got to apply to all human beings, simply by the nature of them being human. You'd have to deny that other human beings weren't human to deny them the same rights. So we argue that all human beings, regardless of sex or race, have these rights. They're rights which stem from our requirements to flourish as a certain sort of entity. They're therefore natural. They stem from our nature. And they apply equally to all human beings. Therefore, all human beings should be equally free. And by that we mean they should be free to produce goods and services, to trade goods and services. Their physical integrity should be free. They should not be aggressed against by other individuals or the state. And this is how we derive, in effect, our case for individual freedom, our case for individual rights. We argue that they stem from human nature. They are natural rights. They're not something arbitrary. They're not something we just pull out of our heads because we think it's nice in some way. They stem from our nature as human beings. And they're justifiable. They're part of the natural order of things. Hence they're natural.
Okay, great. What? Yeah, I have to say. So, just pause for a second.
I don't know where he's got it. I was in my jacket pocket.
Oh, okay. Yes. Why is it a good thing to be egoistic?
Libertarians, especially those of us who are adherents of Ayn Rand's philosophy, argue that it's a good thing to be selfish. Now this sounds paradoxical to a lot of people. By this it doesn't mean that we think people should be brutal or rapacious, ignore the rights of other people, or be inconsiderate, for example. Indeed, we would argue that there's a sort of a package deal going on in here. Literally, selfishness means, to be concerned with one's self-interest. Now, we would argue that it's not in the self-interest of the individual to behave in a brutal, a rapacious manner. What's in the self-interest of the individual is, in fact, to fulfill themselves as a human being, to fulfill their faculties. Now, the only way they can do that is in a state of freedom, is by respecting, their own rights and respecting the rights of others. And of course, it's in our self-interest. It's absurd to say that it's not selfish to fall in love or to care for other people, or to be considerate to other people. So we fundamentally reject the idea that virtues are somehow unselfish. We would argue that all the virtues which indeed are virtuous are profoundly selfish. They relate to our self-interest, our fulfilling of ourselves as rational human beings. And we would argue that it's the religious philosophies, Christian and indeed others, and political ideologies which say you shouldn't be selfish, profoundly attack individual rights. If you say someone shouldn't be selfish, you're saying they shouldn't act in their self-interest. They shouldn't act for the sake of their own happiness. Well, this simply undermines all human freedom. You know, people should be free. They have a right to be free. They have a right to be happy. They have a right to fulfill themselves. There's a package deal going on here. The people who use the word selfish in a pejorative sense are trying to equate self-interested behaviour and seeking of self-interest with rapacious behaviour. That's simply not true. And of course they do this then in order to infringe individual rights. You know, if you don't have a right to be selfish, then presumably it's right for them to enslave you or make you work for the good of others as they see it, or enslave you for the good of the state or the religion or the race or whatever particular cause it is that they're peddling. So we argue that people have a right to be selfish, and that means fulfilling themselves, fulfilling their own happiness, living for themselves. It doesn't mean aggressing against other people. It means living as a free individual and respecting the rights of other people. And this is a challenge to, you know, the religious philosophies of humanity throughout its history. This is one of the reasons why libertarianism is a very radical creed, because it's challenging the heritage of all religious philosophies and indeed many other secular moral philosophies. But we would argue that it's the only philosophy which can defend individual happiness, justify human happiness, and enable people to be free and happy and to fulfill themselves.
Great. What are the more important aspects of Rand's teaching?
To summarise any philosophy in a few words is quite difficult. I think Ayn Rand herself tried to summarise her philosophy in 3 words. I think she said, reality, there is an objective existence. Existence exists. Reality is objective. There is a world out there. Rationalism, you know, that we can understand it, that human reason and perception can understand reality, and the consequences of that, which is essentially egoism. Reality is a world of individual entities, not of some sort of mythical wholes, you know, not sort of holistic entities like races and nations. Only individual entities exist. And the individual entities we call human beings exist, and exist in their own right, and have a right to exist for themselves. Therefore, these 3 things hang together. You know, there is an objective reality out there. We can understand it rationally, and our rational understanding shows us that it's a reality composed of individual entities, and that human beings, in the sense of some of the most important of those entities, have a right to be free, to pursue their self-interest, to pursue their right to happiness. So it's a challenge. Her philosophy is a challenge to mystical philosophies. It's a challenge to philosophies which say we can't understand reality, or that reality, you know, is somehow subjective, that it can't be grasped, or there in a sense that there is no real reality out there. It's a fruit of individual whims. It attacks sort of subjectivist ideas, it attacks mystical ideas, it attacks the sort of Hegelian philosophy which underlies both the Marxist and the fascist varieties of totalitarianism. It attacks all philosophies which argue that there are sort of somehow holistic entities above the individual, like the race or society or the nation or whatever, to which the individual should be sacrificed. So it really focuses in on the individual and the individual's existence, the individual's nature, and the individual's right to exist for him and herself.
Great. What, in your opinion, is the importance of achieving individual success, for example, through various psychological training and related aspects?
Western societies, indeed even in America to a degree, still has an enormous heritage of simple opposition to human happiness, to flourishing, to prosperity, to achieving what we want to achieve. So libertarians are very favourable to what we might say the ethos of self-help, the ethos of success. I mean, it's no accident that, you know, during the emergence and the success of libertarianism in the 19th century, you had Samuel Smiles, you had a whole literature of self-help, of achieving success, how to achieve success. And libertarians defend that sort of literature now, and indeed sort of put what's often seen as rather superficial ethos into a deeper philosophical content. So we would argue that the literature of self-help, the literature of success, is very important, and that people should be encouraged to look at this. And I think too that the emergence of a lot of things like EST, like insight, a lot of sort of self-help psychological therapies, the emergence of humanistic psychotherapy and psychology, is part and parcel of the whole libertarian revival of our times. Even those thinkers, I mean, like Werner Erhard in EST, like a number of the humanistic psychotherapists who don't necessarily see any great political connection or any political associations of their ideas. In fact, their ideas do lead to the broader political ethos of libertarianism, because it defends individual happiness. It says, you know, you can be free, you can be happy, there are ways of achieving freedom and happiness and working for yourself and living for yourself, and you should live and behave in that way. More significantly, indeed, many of the humanistic therapists and psychologists have ultimately seen, of course, that there is a political message to their ideas. I mean, I don't think it's any accident, for example, that Abraham Maslow, one of the most important of the humanistic thinkers, started off as a Marxist and a Freudian, worked his way out of those ideas through psychology, focused on individual achievement, focused on what he called self-actualizing people, self-actualization, rejected the sort of collectivist and determinist ideas of Freudianism and Marxism, and then in fact embraced politically libertarianism. You know, I think he actually did indeed read Ayn Rand and so on, and started endorsing ethical individualism, selfishness, rational egoism, and saw that this had to end up as a political ideology as well, that you couldn't really defend the right to be free, the right to be happy, and then somehow say, but socialism is right at the same time. The two just don't go together. Success and happiness go with a free economy, you know, go with a capitalist social order. They don't go with socialism.
Okay, and just a supplementary to that, how do movements such as Insight or EST or similar views seek to bring about this individual success?
All these humanistic psychotherapies and systems like EST, like Insight, and there are many, many more. All of them, even when they don't have any political message, all of them hone in on a number of points. They basically argue that individuals are not determined by their prior existence, or rather, insofar as they are influenced by their prior existence, they don't have to be. That you can break free of, you know, the conditioning of previous experience, of social life, of your upbringing, of the people around you, that you can break free of these things, that you can be your own person, that you have free will. And indeed that you have a right to this, that you have a right to be happy, and that you can achieve happiness. And then they give you very many effective psychotherapeutic techniques in both a group context and an individual context to help free you of previous conditioning, to help free you of the influence of other people, and that you can achieve happiness, and that you ought to achieve happiness, and you have a right to achieve happiness. So this is the message which comes over in lots of these sort of psychotherapeutic, self-help, self-transformation, growth seminars and so on. That's the fundamental message of them. It's a very, very humane message and a very helpful message, and lots of them I think are to be recommended. Many of them have inconsistent elements, or have some things that don't work, or some things that are silly. Of course, you expect any idea system to be mixed like this, but fundamentally they're very beneficial. Fundamentally, they're humane, they're rationalistic, they're progressive, they're individualistic, and very helpful to individuals who wish to achieve, you know, freedom for themselves, who wish to achieve happiness for themselves.
Great. How has the libertarian philosophy manifested itself in popular culture? Well, so we've already discussed this, but we know. So
yeah, I'll come out more consistently.
Okay. Yes.
Right. Libertarian ideas have always been, I think, implicit in a fundamental sense within popular culture. Popular culture has preserved the idea of individual responsibility. It's preserved the idea that individuals can act to defend themselves, to defend freedom, to defend their values. You know, the sort of ethos of high noon, the ethos of a man's got to do what a man's got to do. The idea that there is good and evil in the world, and we can know what is good and know what is evil, and that evil should be opposed. That individuals should oppose injustice in any form. They should oppose it even when it's in the form of the state or the authorities. These are the sorts of themes that run through the Western, the crime thriller, you know, the detective thriller in science fiction. You also get, especially in science fiction, a very pro-rationalistic, pro-scientific philosophy as well, which links up with the broader pro-rationalism of libertarianism. A commitment to scientific progress, a commitment to material goods, a commitment to scientific progress and discovery. The idea that the world isn't a hostile and alien place, it's a realm which we can master, that humanity has a right to master nature and manifest its control and progress and understand things. And this is the root of progress. All these are the sorts of ideas you get in popular culture, as opposed to the ideas of defeat and degradation and mysticism you get in sort of modern art and modernistic high culture. And indeed, these ideas are often not merely just implicit in popular culture, they're often explicit. In fact, science fiction writers, for example, like Robert Heinlein, Powell Anderson, many others are indeed libertarians and have expounded, you know, the political and economic ideas of libertarianism in their science fiction. For example, Heinlein's novel *The Moon is the Heart's Mistress*, the story of a sort of anarcho-capitalist revolution on the moon. Many of Powell Anderson's novels have explore the ideas of free market economics and of individual liberty versus state power. Many people who've been converted to libertarianism have now become science fiction authors. People like Jim Hogan and so on have explicitly put forward libertarian scenarios in their science fiction books. A great number of detective writers, for example, which I've got Edward Klein, is now very much influenced by Ayn Rand and is exploring her ideas in his detective fiction. To go back a little bit to older writers, I mean, Mickey Spillane was very influenced by Ayn Rand, and although not, I don't know if you necessarily want to call him a libertarian, but certainly expounds the idea of individual responsibility and the right of the individual to pursue justice against villains in whatever guise they come. So there's a very strong link between popular culture and libertarianism. Popular culture values have influenced libertarians, and again, the sort of dialectical relationship here, libertarians have gone back into popular culture and expounded libertarian ideas in science fiction novels, in detective novels, and even in rock music for that matter. The heavy metal rock group Rush, who are influenced by Ayn Rand, have written a number of songs expounding her ideas, and indeed one concept album. They've in fact done a sort of heavy metal rock version of Ayn Rand's novella Anthem, and have sort of made this into a heavy metal rock album. I must say I'm not particularly fond of heavy metal myself. I'm more a 50s Elvis and rockabilly fan, but it's good to see this sort of thing happening, and it is increasingly going on. Great.
What is the significance of the TV programme The Prisoner for libertarians?
Patrick McGowan's TV series The Prisoner is another very strong example of this relationship between popular culture and libertarianism. McGowan, probably one of the 20th century's finest actors, had previously been in a series called Danger Man in Britain, although I think it was retitled Secret Agent in America, which again had the very strong elements of libertarian values in terms of the pursuit of justice and opposition to evil and so on. In the series that followed that, The Prisoner, this became a completely explicit libertarian television series. not merely as a result of McGoohan's involvement, but as a result of the scriptwriter and the man who conceived the series, George Markstein, who was basically a libertarian. And The Prisoner basically was perhaps the most ambitious attempt ever in television to expound the values of individual freedom, the right of the individual to be an individual in a sort of science fictional type context. I'm not a number, I'm a free man is the sort of phrase shouted by McGoohan at the beginning of the series, and the whole series centres on this former secret agent being imprisoned by mysterious people, we never know quite who they are, who try to break his will as an individual, but not merely do that, but try to harness the individual for the good of a greater cause, as they put it. And these ideas are discussed extensively throughout the series. I remember one particular exchange between McGoohan and someone defending the system of the village in which he is imprisoned. And the other person argues with him, but society, I think, I can't paraphrasing roughly the exchange now, but you must work for the good of society. Society has the right to control you, has the right to sort of look after its members. And then they say to McGoohan, haven't you got any values? And he says, yes, different values. And that's the theme that comes through the series, the different values of individualism versus the values of collectivism and control embodied in the mysterious authorities in this village. And what's also interesting is, of course, the authorities realise that the only way in which they can maintain themselves is by somehow morally compromising the individual and using the individual. So one of the sub-themes of the whole series is this attempt to sort of break the individual's will and manipulate the individual, which McGoohan consistently and successfully resists throughout the whole series. So The Prisoner is not merely probably the best example, one of the most consistent embodiments of libertarian ideas in popular culture form, but also has been an enormous inspiration, artistic inspiration to libertarians. Ayn Rand talks about art as being a sort of form of emotional fuel. It's something which keeps you going, sustains you. And certainly, me personally, and lots of my colleagues and associates have found The Prisoner to be, an enormous source of emotional fuel, a great inspiration for us, to go on working.
Right. Up to this point.
Excuse me. Oh, what's the next one?
Yeah, sure. Pressing ahead.
Right. It's amazing how long this takes, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, then how are we going to bring it all down to 1 hour? It's amazing. Right, okay. Ron,
Yes.
what is the relationship between atheism and libertarianism?
Well, libertarianism is a broad philosophy. So should we start again?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
start again.
no,
Yeah,
actually,
come
no.
on. Although there are some libertarians who are also Christians, I think it's fair to say that the majority of libertarians are atheists, and fairly militant ones at that. It seems to us that, firstly, Christianity, like all religions, is actually profoundly hostile to individual happiness, hostile to freedom, and simply morally not suited to human beings. I think libertarians reject the idea of turning the other cheek, believe that they're right, they should defend their rights, not turn the other cheek, and that the morality of sort of self-abnegation, which is inherent in Christianity and virtually every other religion, is simply an immoral belief. It's not a desirable form of morality. So they reject the moral teachings of Jesus, and indeed, on general rationalist grounds, would argue that there is no evidence for the existence of a God in whatever particular form is being advocated, whether it's the Christian God or the Jewish God or any other God for that matter. So there's simply no good evidence to believe in the existence of such an entity. That the moral views put forward by Christians are generally abhorrent. So there really is no place for such ideas in their philosophy. Libertarianism is a fundamentally secular belief. In fact, I think the general libertarian attitude would be, if God did exist, it would be necessary to abolish him. Simply be the state writ large in a sort of metaphysical sense. So, no, I just think on all terms, libertarianism is a modern secular ideology and rejects Christianity and any other form of religious belief.
Okay. How and why?
Do you want to swap back? So, do you not
Do you,
Send it on. I'll be great.
I think I contacted just there.
Oh yeah, you do.
Just,
Just
sort of, yeah, sort of,
So he's
yeah.
Okay, let's put that.
okay. How and why do you struggle against the anti-smoking campaign?
I got involved in opposition to the anti-smoking campaign because it did seem to me that, although it might seem a relatively minor issue, it's increasingly becoming a spearhead of what I, and in fact a number of other people, called health fascism. As socialism is being defeated in the sort of economic realm, increasingly what one is finding is that the same political agenda is being pushed on other sort of single issue campaigns, and many of them centre in the whole area of health. And in the last decade, I suppose, what one will find if you look at it is that in Britain and America, I think pretty much in Europe as well, that a large number of sort of collectivist thinkers are using the idea of preventive medicine to push forward a political creed of state paternalism and state control. And the anti-smoking movement is, in a sense, the tip of that particular iceberg. I mean, they're also opposed to alcohol, and they also want to push an agenda of, in effect, total paternalism over health. Their view is that an individual's health isn't his or her own concern, it's the concern of the state, which should cajole, encourage, etc. by the law, and then eventually coerce by the force of law the individual into being healthy. And stopping people smoking is just one aspect of that. And this is, of course, exactly the philosophy of the German Nazis, who were in fact the pioneers of the anti-smoking movement and who rejected the libertarian idea that an individual owned his or her own self. They rejected that quite correctly, as in their terms, as a liberal perversion, and argued that the individual had an obligation to be healthy, and the state had an obligation to impose health upon the individual, not only for the individual's own good, but for the good of the state, for the good of the race and the strength of the race and the nation. And I think the more you look at it, the more you realise that the smoking issue isn't just a minor one. It is, as I said, at the sharp end of this growth of health fascism, and that's why libertarians need to fight that issue as they need to fight every other infringement of individual liberty. And it's why I, as in fact a health freak myself, as a holder of belts in 3 different martial arts and a regular jogger and roller skater, and taker of lots of vitamins and semi-vegetarian, is resolutely fighting for the right of people to smoke. Although I've never smoked myself and never will do, never have done. So a threat to the right of one is a threat to the right of all, and everyone needs, I think, to sort of come together on this anti-smoking issue at the moment.
Thank you. What is the importance of life extension within libertarianism?
Because libertarianism is fundamentally a pro-science, pro-rationalistic philosophy, that links up very much with, of course, its moral individualism, its belief in the right of the individual to be happy, and quite logically, individuals, libertarians would like to see immortality. They would like to extend their lives and their happiness infinitely. That's an obvious, an obvious value to the individual, and they therefore are very interested in any scientific developments which will encourage that. And of course, the growing interest in life extension is seen as a fundamentally pro-science, pro-individual happiness development. And again, it's also a political issue. It's quite fascinating that lots of collectivists, both Christian collectivists and left-wing collectivists, are actually very hostile to life extension, to research into immortality, into the very concept of immortality. And of course that's quite understandable as we see it. We see really, in effect, the fundamental political division of being everything that favours life and happiness on one side, and everything which encourages death, degradation, decline as being on the other. And it's no accident, therefore, that libertarians want to see happiness and life extended infinitely, by means of science, and being in favour of that. And the people on the religious and political left, so to speak, opposing that. So libertarians are therefore very favourable to the idea of life extension, are involved in life extension, are involved in publicising, whatever progress has been made, and encouraging people to seek to extend their happiness and their freedom, in a sense, in infinite terms. So libertarianism, in a sense, is a philosophy of wanting to eradicate both death and taxes. Neither do we see ultimately as being inevitable.
Right, so we're going into part 3 now. Do you want to go straight on?
Sure, yeah. Just another wipe.
Okay, so well.
Yeah, any chance of battery?
Right, okay, ready?
Okay.
Okay,
Roll camera.
rolling.
Well,
You
I'll
can
do it. You want to
can
do it? Okay. Roll camera.
Well, I'm looking forward to the outtake sequence of this.
Oh,
With all
yes.
the-
It'll be alright when I blast out. Roll camera.
Still rolling.
Let's go. Action.
What would you say to the criticism that libertarianism would remove all protection from the poor and disadvantaged within society?
The idea that libertarianism is a philosophy or a policy which somehow disfavours the poor or would be of no benefit to the poor is probably the accusation that annoys me most. I mean, it's precisely freedom, having a free economy, which has lifted humanity out of the poverty and brutality which has been its natural state for most of its existence. The crocodile tears of socialists over poverty, it just is disgusting. Socialism doesn't remove poverty, it's capitalism which removes poverty, and it's socialism which creates it. And the quickest way to remove poverty is the policy of laissez-faire, and letting people be free to trade and produce their goods and raise their standard of living. So far from socialism removing poverty, it does the reverse, it creates it. And of course the idea that somehow government intervention works for the benefit of the poor or the weak is nonsense. If you actually historically look at government intervention, you find that, of course, what government intervention benefits, or the people government intervention benefits, is actually the wealthy, is special business interests, special financial interests. If you actually look behind socialism, if you actually look behind the various interventionist policies within the economy, you'll find invariably they benefit a specific group or interest within the economy. And there's an enormous amount of research on this. In other words, it's government intervention which favours, the wealthy, the privileged, and so on, who use the state, who use state power to enhance or preserve their interests. Examples: subsidies, tariffs, special privileges. The bourgeois trade unions, like the professions, like medicine and so on, where the professions get special legislation to prevent people from practicing those trades. Taxation policy, which prevents the accumulation of new capital, prevents companies from prospering and growing, and which maintains the competitive position of larger companies. If you actually look, for example, in American history at so-called antitrust legislation during the Progressive period, you find the sort of government intervention there was in fact brought in at the bequest of big business. The economy was becoming more and more competitive. The free economy was working, and the position of established businesses was threatened by growing competition, by new businesses. Therefore, those old businesses, those old financial interests, called for the government to bring in all sorts of government intervention, often in the name of anti-business, but ironically in the real interest of business, to restrict competition. So far from government power ever being for the benefit of the poor, the needy, the unprivileged, the weak, or whatever, it's always exercised actually for the benefit of the wealthy, the privileged, and so on. Government is just no answer to any problem. Government is the problem, and it's sweeping away government problem that will in fact create a harmonious society, a prosperous society, a free society for all people, and will simply do away with ultimately the idea of poverty and the needy and so on. That's what a free society does. The poorest person, even in our semi-free societies, is like a king compared to the people in pre-capitalist societies and indeed non-capitalist societies that exist in the world today.
Thank you. Okay. Is not altruism the basis of civilization?
The idea that altruism is the basis of civilization is just a nonsense. The basis of civilization is individual achievement, is the individual achieving their goals, their vision, against the opposition of the collectivity, against the opposition of the tribe, the nation, the society, the church, everyone who will do the individual down, who will decry their efforts. It's altruism, the idea that individuals should exist for the sake of other people, which has always undercut progress, which always denies the individual their right, their freedom to achieve their goals, to seek their goals, to try and implement their visions. So it's altruism which destroys and prevents civilization, and individualism, egoism, rational self-interest, which creates all the goods, the material goods, the immaterial goods, which constitute civilization.
Thank you. What would you say to the conservative who would hold that individualism and libertarianism undermine the foundations, values and traditions that make a society viable?
The conservative attack on libertarianism just seems to me to be so wrong-headed, even more wrong-headed than many of the socialist attacks. I mean, insofar as there is a tradition in the West, it's a tradition of individual liberty. It's a tradition of the individual freeing him and herself from the constraints of society, the constraints of the church, the constraints of illegitimate authority. And when the individual is free, and when the individual follows the rules of freedom, doesn't coerce against other individuals, then you have a spontaneous order. This is Friedrich Hayek's term. You have a beneficial social order, a harmonious social order, in which basically not merely people profit economically, not only do they achieve profit by the producing and trading of goods, but of course their social relationships are harmonious. If you don't aggress against other people, if you respect their rights, then they will live freely and they won't aggress against yours. And in which the most beneficial forms of social behaviour will flourish. In other words, you don't need to... I mean, if, how can we put it, the nuclear family is a beneficial social order, then it will exist spontaneously. You don't have to impose the family upon people. People will simply live in family units because that's the best way of achieving happiness, the best way of achieving prosperity, the best way of living. And if you leave people free, they will experiment, they will live in various ways, and presumably those ways which create happiness and satisfy people the most, those ways will prosper, those ways will be followed. So the conservative may often be right about particular forms of social behaviour, what is the best for the individual. But that means precisely that it doesn't have to be imposed upon them. It will emerge spontaneously. If you leave people to be free, if you leave them to rise and fall as they see fit, then those forms of behaviour which are profitable in every sense, in the material and the immaterial sense, those forms of living and behaving will flourish and will prosper and will be adopted by the majority of people. So we don't have to impose good social values upon people. Good social values will emerge harmoniously and spontaneously from a free society.
What would you say to the green argument that capitalism pollutes the environment and creates a consumer society that would exhaust the world's resources and bring about a disaster?
Well, the Greens are certainly correct that capitalism produces a consumer society, and that's a damn good thing. That's precisely what the world's population wants and needs. It wants to consume goods and services. The idea that capitalism somehow destroys the environment and isn't sustainable in the long term is a simple nonsense. Insofar as there are real environmental problems, they are the result of not having proper private property rights extended over all property. People deplete natural resources because natural resources often aren't owned properly and therefore are not used economically. So to solve what real ecological problems do exist, that can be solved by the extension of property rights to all natural resources, and they will therefore then be harnessed via the free market to satisfying the needs of all the people of the world. The idea that resources are going to run out, I mean, this is a typical sort of anti-life assumption that the environmentalists have. The fact is, capitalism creates and discovers new resources. There is only one way to ensure a future for ourselves, and that is to allow the free mind to work within a free market to produce more resources and discover more resources. We will never run out of real resources as long as we have the primary resource, which is the intelligence in our own head. They are simply wrong, and they are proved historically wrong by the constant rediscovery, the constant discovery of new resources, the discovery of how to exploit existing resources. We didn't have any conception of their value or how they could be used, and of making resources via the application of our reason to the world. No, our future is sustainable as long as we have a free market and as long as the mind is free to apply its intelligence to the world. And there are no limits. There are no limits, and our intelligence will, of course, take us off this planet. We're not restricted to the resources on this planet. By applying our reason, we will colonize and develop the whole of the cosmos eventually. And the universe is infinite, and our prospects are infinite. And when you look at the philosophy of the Greens, you'll find that this is, if anything, is a worse philosophy than even Marxism or National Socialism. It's a philosophy which, in fact, is completely opposed to human happiness. I mean, the most extreme of the Greens, in fact, actually believe that humanity should be exterminated off this planet. They believe that only the natural order from which they exclude human beings has any sort of value. It is an unbelievably genocidal ideology which will produce exactly what they predict. It will produce, devastation and of this planet. But it will be as a result of their ideas, not as a result of the free market. It's the free market which will bring, unceasing and infinite progress to humanity.
Yeah. Some Marxists would say that the entire capitalist argument emerges as a justification of the fact that a small minority controls the majority of wealth within society and exploits the labour of the workers in order to maintain and extend this wealth. How would you reply to this?
Marxist arguments are just unbelievably bogus. Capitalism isn't an economic order which benefits a small minority. It's self-evidently an economic order which benefits the masses as a whole. Do you want to start again?
May as well. Do you think we ought to call?
Oh, yes, I think so.
Yeah.
May I just
We won't
Should we
go far
continue?
then.
Should you go for it?
Okay. Marxist arguments are just so unbelievably bogus. One really is surprised one has to spend any time refuting them anymore. Capitalism isn't an economic or social order which benefits only a small minority of people. It's an economic order which self-evidently works by providing goods and services to the great mass of ordinary people at prices they can afford. The incentive of profit-making directs the production of goods and services to the satisfaction of the majority of people. It doesn't concentrate wealth, it distributes it more widely than any other social order. It enriches people as a result of their satisfying the needs of all other people by providing them goods and services on the markets. And it raises, of course, it doesn't destroy inequality totally. How can it? But we don't want to reduce inequality. Inequality is not per se unjust. Who cares if people are unequal, if all are unbelievably wealthy, all as rich as the kings of previous civilizations? What do I care if I have 2 cars, if someone has 10 cars, or if someone has 20 cars, if they earn their 20 cars by selling goods and services and enriching me and enabling me to live a prosperous and wealthy life. No, I mean the Marxist arguments are just bogus. And the irony is that their description of capitalism, of course, applies absolutely perfectly to the practice of their ideas. It's precisely Marxist economies, controlled economies, which actually produce a small aristocratic group of people who exploit the labour of others and rule over them in a tyrannical manner. So no, it's capitalism liberates people, spreads the wealth, raises everyone up, and it's socialist, Marxist, collectivist economies which sinks everyone into oppression, tyranny, poverty and suffering.
Thank you. What would you say to the argument that a society and nation should have goals which transcend those of the individual?
Sorry, I hit that. Is that positioned okay still?
You've lost sound.
Sorry.
Maybe just cut it loose.
You got the question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, right.
The idea that society or the nation has some purpose or existence above the individual is a simple nonsense. It's a fallacy of reification, if I can use the jargon for the moment. Society, the nation, doesn't exist. Only individuals exist. And these collective nouns like society, race, nation, church, or whatever, they're simply masks when they're used in this sort of way. What they really mean are that some individuals will be controlling and manipulating and using other people for their purposes in the nation, in the cause of this mythical entity, the nation, or whatever it is. Sorry, can we do that again? I mumbled that. Can I start again? Yeah, okay, right. The idea that the nation or society exists above the individual and should control him or her, for some greater purpose is just a complete nonsense. Societies and nations, religions or whatever, don't exist as individual entities. Only individuals exist. So when you hear someone saying, we must do this for the good of the nation, or we must control you for the good of society or whatever, what they actually really mean is, we must control you for the sake of some other group of individuals, or for my sake, or the sake of my gang, or my church, or whatever banner they happen to be raising at the time. Only individuals exist. These entities, these collective nouns, don't exist. They are just a mask for one group of people to exploit another group of people. And that, I think, is one of the core messages of libertarianism, is to realise, as I say, only individuals exist. They exist for their own sake and happiness. And if anyone starts saying, you must exist for some greater cause or some greater entity, then you're being exploited, because those entities don't exist. Show me a nation, show me a society. They don't exist. Only individuals exist.
Thank you.
Yeah, should we? Have you got any more questions? I mean, there's one or two which we might want to.
Not well. This got to the bottom of this. We can think about more hot points.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, for instance, one is, given that capitalism is such a good system, how do you explain the existence of economic recession, mass unemployment, and general?
Are we rolling now?
Are we rolling?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Mass unemployment and other economic problems.
Mass unemployment, recession, and other economic problems are always the result of government intervention. For example, the business cycle is a result of government interference in the money supply, a result of either inflation or deflation of the currency, or the debasement of the currency by the government. Unemployment is the result of government interventions of one sort or another into the free market. Wherever you find a problem, when you actually look at it, it is not the result of capitalism. It's the result of interfering with capitalism by the government. So I'm sure you'll have plenty of other economists on this programme who can go into great detail as to why that is the case in every particular area. But show me a problem and I'll show you government interfering in human affairs.
Okay. How do you explain the prevalence of mass starvation in the third world?
the prevalence of mass starvation in the third world is, well, let's just say that the nations where you have starvation are often called the have-not nations, and the one thing they have not is freedom. The nations in which you get starvation and poverty are the nations in which you've got massive government intervention, the attempt to eradicate the free market. And in many cases, of course, many of the mass famines we've seen recently in Ethiopia and so on are not even the results of the blundering of governments in the economic field. They're very often, like the great famines in the Soviet Union, the deliberate manipulations of governments. They are deliberate class and racial warfare exercised by the government against groups in their population of which they disapprove. So many of the famines that we see around us, as I say, are deliberately created by governments to eradicate class and race enemies, or they're the result of the destruction of the free market in those countries, you know, by collectivist Marxist regimes.
Okay, that's great. Is there anything else? I think that's pretty much the last.
Yeah, the Mercury Cup.
But well, no, just one other thing that comes to mind. What would you say to the view that basically people don't want to have libertarianism? They're quite happy with current arrangements. So why should they change their way of doing things to accommodate a small group of people who call themselves libertarians?
Most people seem to want prosperity and freedom for themselves, even when, of course, they want to deny it for some reason to other people. The very fact that you know, the Soviets had to build a Berlin Wall to keep people into their area. You know, the fact that the great problem in all the Marxist and collectivist nations in the world they have is actually trying to keep their populations in and prevent them from fleeing to the West, seems to indicate that most people seem to naturally want the goodies which a free society can produce, not merely the material goodies, but the spiritual, the immaterial goodies of simply being left alone and not persecuted, of worshipping how you want to, reading the books that you want to read, just living as you see fit. So most people seem to want this. The real problem, of course, is lots of people want that for themselves, but then often want to deny it to other people. What libertarians have to do is to convince everyone that, you know, to enjoy the freedoms that you want to enjoy, you must allow everyone else to live freely as well, even if you don't like the results of their freedom, even if you don't like the religion they adopt, or the music they listen to, or the drugs that they take, or whatever. That you can only have your freedom if you let other people be free. I'm optimistic. I think that lesson is being spread throughout the world. As, you know, already the Bolshevik system is collapsing in the East. Hardly any of the Marxists believe in Marxists anymore. The racial socialism of South African apartheid is collapsing. I'm optimistic in the long run. I think people are getting the message that that state power, collectivism in all its forms doesn't work, doesn't deliver happiness, doesn't deliver freedom, doesn't deliver prosperity. And they want, you know, what the free world, or what the semi-free world, you know, has, which is freedom.
Great. I think that's a lot. As far as I'm concerned.